Hello, and welcome to Story Radio, the podcast for readers, writers, and lovers of literature everywhere. Today, we're talking to Marc S Perlman, author of The Riddle of the Trees, a literary espionage thriller set in the Bielorussia and Belavezskaya forests spanning Poland and Belarus. Can I ask you to correct me on those?
That sounds good enough to me. I actually always apologize when I say those names to any Polish or Belarusian listeners because I probably butcher the names as well.
It is published by Koehler Books and was published on March the 10th, 2026. Marc is a lawyer based in New York City, a graduate of Bowdoin College and Cardozo Law School, and a lifelong traveller through Eastern Europe. He first conceived of this novel while biking through the Belavezskaya Forest from Poland into Belarus. Welcome to Story Radio, Marc.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Can you give our listeners a brief introduction to the novel?
Sure. So The Riddle of the Trees, it's an espionage novel. It's about an American named Jack Miller. He's just a regular guy, and he is going to Eastern Europe to visit the Belarusian village where his father and grandparents lived until World War II. And he's going to try to learn by being there what happened to cause this enduring rift between his father and his grandfather. And while he's in the midst of his travels, he's in this border forest between Poland and Belarus, the Belavezskaya Forest, and he starts to witness strange things that are happening in the forest. And then he gets to Minsk, and in Minsk he meets his guide, and obviously she's a beautiful woman, and he starts to fall for her. Her name is Anna, and she takes him to the villages. He does learn what happened to cause this rift. He also starts to understand through her the fear of living in an autocratic state. And he then learns that Anna is working for the underground to try to overthrow the Belarusian government. And he then, against his better judgment and spurred in part by the revelation of what happened with his family, he follows her on this very reckless mission into the forest. And things go seriously awry there, and he ends up carrying the fate of nations literally in his pocket.
Great. The border of Europe and Russia offers a lot of potential for a novel in the way the Berlin Wall did during the Cold War. Could you tell us how it influenced your novel?
Well, I find borders to be very interesting. It was a large influence on the novel, and there's a lot of border crossing. And whether a border is a wall or a fence or just an invisible line through a field, I think it has so much significance because it's the divider between languages, cultures. It can be the divider between freedom and tyranny, like in this case, where it's the border between NATO and Belarus, which had been called the last dictatorship in Europe. I think now it might not be considered the last dictatorship, but it certainly is one of them. So I think borders are very interesting, and they lend themselves to a lot of drama in that sense. And I think, as you alluded to in the introduction, I was first inspired to write this book by being in this forest and witnessing this border. And um, I had I'm a lawyer, but I'd always liked writing, and I'd written some short stories, most of which, or all of which, are still sitting in a drawer somewhere. I think some of them deservedly so. Others, I think, maybe should see the light of day. But I always wanted to write a novel, and the question of what kind of novel to write. And I always liked espionage stories, in part because of these borders. But I really didn't know where to start. And I was on a trip similar to Jack Miller's. I was going to see the villages in Belarus where my great grandparents were from. But I didn't want the trip just to be going to some dreary villages, so I expanded it. I went to Poland first, and I read about this Białowieża forest, which is right on the border with Belarus. And it's the last primeval forest in Europe, which sounded to me very exotic. I had images of Grimm's fairy tales and Little Red Riding Hood walking through. It has this border running through it between NATO and Belarus, and it also has European bison. I had no idea those existed outside of the Great Plains of the United States, but it sounded interesting. So I went there and I took a tour of the forest, which was pretty. I wouldn't say it was exceptional. But then I rented a bicycle and I rode across the border. And I was the only person on this road. I got to the border post. I got stamped out of Poland into Belarus. Then I get to the actual border fence. There was a fence at that point. And I wait there. There's a padlock on the door. I don't know what to do on the gate to the fence. And then the soldier walks down the road. He's a young kid, maybe in his maybe 20, and he's in camo and he has a AK-47 on his back and he's bouncing a little rubber ball. And he gets to the fence and he unlocks the padlock, lets me into Belarus, and I go for a bike ride for about an hour. And I just thought, this is really cool. This is going to be my book. So from that moment, I really started everything, every person I met during my trip, every place I went, I started incorporating that and developing this plot. But that really, for me, was inspirational in part because of this really interesting border in the middle of this forest between two very different nations. So yeah, that's a long way of saying yes. Borders are, I think, very interesting. I think they lend themselves to really good drama, and that was really what inspired me to do this novel.
I liked your scene with the football being kicked across the border, and
Well, we might
yeah.
read that later.
I believe Russia has recently closed all the European land borders. I'm not sure for
Yeah,
how
and
long.
that's true. And the way this novel evolved, it was very slow. So I went into Belarus in 2011. I would not go there now. Um, but I went, I got back, I started writing. I got maybe 30, 40 pages in. I had a lot of the big scenes in my head. They were like movies in my head. I'm a very visual person. The difficulty for me was the sort of connective tissue between the scenes. And then for a decade, I let it linger. And that's beyond writer's block. That just, I think you can call that laziness. And then 10 years later, I said, enough is enough. And I really just sat down and spent 3 weeks plotting this very closely. And then the writing after that was easy. But you mentioned now the borders are closed. And as a writer, I had to make a determination there because things had changed. The world had changed significantly in 10 years. We had the Ukraine war, which actually broke out about 4 or 5 months after I finished my first draft. And so I had to address that. But also in towards the time I was finishing this in 2021, the president of Belarus, Lukashenko, had actually weaponized the border between Belarus and Poland and to, I think, a lesser extent, Lithuania, sending hundreds or thousands of migrants from Africa, the Middle East across the border. And as a result, Poland and Lithuania put up very large barbed wire fences at the border. There were these two big changes, and I had to address Ukraine, I felt. But this other one, so much of the plot is based on what was plausible in 2011, which was fairly easy crossing of the borders. And I had to decide what to do with that. But acknowledging these closed borders would have so significantly changed the book. I used artistic license to just ignore that fact. I did a lot of research on this. I tried to make it as realistic as possible, but at a certain point, I said, "This is not a dissertation. I have some. This is fiction. I have some ability to use my artistic license and take what I want and leave what I don't want."
The original purpose of Jack's mission is to visit his family home, and it reveals some uncomfortable elements about his family's past. Was this inspired by real cases you've come across?
It wasn't inspired by them. I know there was certainly collaboration during the Holocaust. There were capos, Jewish capos in the ghettos and the camps. But in terms of the collaboration of the type I mentioned in the book, there are a few recorded instances, but nothing really similar. And I didn't purposely draw from that. Um, when I first wrote the book, the first draft, there was no family conflict between Jack's father and his grandfather. There was no Holocaust element at all. It was just a young American going to Europe to explore his family roots. And um, I was having trouble finding an agent, finding a publisher. So I hired a professional editor who was recommended to me by a family friend. And she read it and she said, the plot's excellent, but it's just not believable that this guy, this 30 some odd year old single guy, is going to Belarus to see his family roots, that no one would do that. And I sort of took offense at that because it's exactly what I did. But she said, you need to give him a reason for going there. And so I protested and I said, he doesn't need a reason. But she said, put a reason in. It doesn't need to be big, but put a reason in. So I thought more about it and I said, this is going to be a big reason. It can't just be he is something going on with his father, and so I really developed this extra subplot, and um, in doing that, yeah, I came up with this this Holocaust element, and then the family shame from it. And I think it worked very well in that not only did it give him a reason to go to Jack a reason to go to Belarus, and it was another big reveal somewhere in the story to keep readers turning the page, but it also gave him more of a reason to then this family shame, this guilt by association, gave him more of a reason to then follow Bella with her work in the underground and on this mission to the forest. But no, it was not drawn on a specific instance, but there was collaboration. There certainly had been some.
Yeah, I do think without that, it would be hard to kind of understand his commitment to the underground movement.
Yeah, before that, it really was not that it was completely unbelievable, but less believable. He had fallen for Anna, and he felt this real connection. And I mean, men have done throughout history some very stupid things because of an infatuation with a woman. But I think it did become a lot more believable when it was beyond that. It was really this
Mm.
family shame, questioning his identity based on his family. And the other important lesson for me with that was I learned that editors can be really annoying and really, really important because to me, I think it really helped the book, that one comment.
So that was the main motivation for Jack to work with an underground Belarusian organization. The could you tell us a bit about those organizations, how you researched them for the novel?
With the underground, a lot of that was just, well, the research wasn't specifically on Belarusian undergrounds. I had read about other resistance organizations, but a lot of that was me just developing my own underground movement and how I would want it to work. I drew on, as again, the way I've read about resistance movements in the past, where each individual just knows the person they're reporting to. So I included that, but I tried to develop a more modern way of communication, and that's one of the questions from the start. How do they communicate? And that's finally revealed towards the end. It's one of those things which I'm hoping draws the reader along. But much of the underground, it's sort of an amateur organization. They're students, and I think that that's true of many of these resistance groups. They're students, they're professionals, they're just regular people who are trying to fight back the way they can, and they're putting it all on the line for that. So I worked with what I'd researched and knew about other resistance organizations, but nothing about this is specifically Belarusian in nature.
How did you research the spycraft in the novel in general?
So yeah, I went to books and articles and also novels that I've read. But I would say that this book is not about it's not a book of highly technical spycraft. It's not a book about spycraft just for the sake of showing off what I know about spycraft. I'm not a spy. I think Jean Le Carré was in MI6 or MI5. Other people out there today are from the intelligence community. I'm an insurance regulatory lawyer who loves spy novels. So I think purposely I didn't I didn't want to compete with them. And I created this more amateur organization. The Underground is, as I said, more of an amateur organization. There are CIA officers and Belarusian KGB and Russian FSB. And those are based on what I've read about the hierarchies and of those organizations and how they operate. But again, this isn't the hyper technical spy novel. So it was based on my research.
The release and withholding of information is a particularly important part of how novels in the spy and thriller genre work. Could you tell us a little bit about how you've made your decisions about the control of information?
To me, it was, you mean in order to draw the reader along in that sense?
Yeah, yeah, just kind of not telling us too much, but just, enough to keep us going.
I'm going to give credit for this to Ken Follett. Um, I've read several of his novels, and the Kingsbridge or Knightsbridge series, the Pillars of the Earth, and a few of his other novels, and those are like doorstops. But they're the type where you start on Friday when you get back from work, and then by the time you go back to work on Monday you finished a 1,000-page novel. How does that work? So I guess years ago, it must be before I even started writing this, but was considering writing. Um, I went to his website. I guess I was just looking for another novel of his, and he had a master class in writing. It was a written master class on his website. And to this day, I'm sort of kicking myself for not having printed it out, not having saved it. But what I remember is he's very deliberate in how he writes, in that he said that every page you need to leave one small unresolved item. And then maybe it was every 3 pages, something a little bigger, and then every chapter it has to be a real cliffhanger, a real doozy. So he's very mindful about that. And that's one of the techniques for drawing the reader along. So I really tried to incorporate that, maybe not to the perfection of Ken Follett, but I think it was very helpful in how I approached the writing. So I started with some different plot threads, which are, I guess the reader knows they're going to eventually come together, but at the start they seem somewhat unrelated. And then by bouncing between those different plot threads and slowly weaving them together, and you leave these things unresolved, like how does the underground communicate? What's going on in the forest? Those are some of the bigger ones, but there's smaller pieces as well that I would pepper throughout, and that hopefully, and I think it succeeded to some extent, draws the reader along, makes you want to turn the page, and then by the end, these threads they come together very cleanly. And so I found that master class from Ken Follett to be very, very helpful, and it gave me a real basis on which to approach this.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, I don't think we've had anyone mention Ken Follett before in our interviews.
And I think it lends
Thank
itself
you.
very well to espionage. I mean, he did it with historical fiction, um, but I think it works really well with espionage, where mystery is really the name of the game. I'm not sure that technique would work as well with literary fiction, where you're really trying to delve the depths of human emotion and understand the meaning of life. But certainly with espionage, I say it was a very effective technique.
Hmm. Hmm.
Are you going to write any more novels featuring these particular characters?
I wasn't planning on it, but several people have asked me that, which to me is a great compliment. So I've started thinking about possible plots with these characters. It might not be the next book I write, but it definitely is something I'm thinking about now based on it. I wasn't planning on it. I thought this was just a single novel, but enough people have asked that I think it might be worth trying. But we'll see. We'll see.
I was intrigued by the character of Franklin, the lap dancer stroke computer programmer,
Mhm.
and was interested to see if she could, if she ever got out of prison.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that's one of I didn't want it to be too happy an ending. So
Yes.
some people got thrown to the dogs, and some people
Yeah.
were left in limbo. But she certainly, I thought she was a good character, and yeah, I think I would have to, if I do a follow-up, I would definitely have to address her and some of the other members in the underground.
So that's led me on to my next question, which is, what are you working on now? Do you have a new project?
I have two new projects, and the difficult thing for me is figuring out deciding which one I want to devote the next year or two of my life to, because this is obviously a long process. One of them, they're very different genres. One is sort of I guess, a fantasy of old New York, and then one of them is I would call it a low-tech sci-fi novel. And I really like both projects, and I've started outlining both of them, but I can't do two at the same time. So I have to make the difficult decision shortly about which one I want to really focus on.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Mark. It's been fascinating to learn more about your book. Would you like to read an extract from it
I would
for
love
us now?
to. I would love to. So I'm going to read about Jack's first experience in the forest. It's just a lead into what I'm going to read. So this is Jack's first experience in the forest. He goes to Bialystok, Poland. He meets another American solo traveler, and they agree to travel together for a day. So they go to a very small town in far eastern Poland, and they're on some farm fields which lead right up to the Belarusian border. And across the border, the forest rises up. And they see some kids from the farms who are they're playing soccer, and they're right on the border, and they ask to join. And also, you should to know for this is that Simon, the American traveler who Jack is with, he speaks fluent Polish he learned it from his grandmother. Then suddenly, through no skill of his own, Jack found himself with the ball and no one between him and the goal. He lumberingly dribbled forward, hoping to get close enough to the goal before kicking. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw the boy in the green jacket charging at him, and Jack knew he had to take a shot. A little off balance, he kicked hard at the ball and watched it sail high into the air, arch away from the goal, fly over the broad strip of sand, and rustle through the branches of a small group of birch trees. The ball had landed in Belarus. Everyone stopped in his tracks and stared across the border in silence. Then Jack spoke. "Are we allowed to go get it?" Simon translated, and the boy in the green jacket responded. "No," Simon translated back to Jack. "They never cross. Some of the older kids in their school have tried it for fun, but their parents forbid it." "So what do we do?" Jack said to Simon. "Just leave it there and leave these kids without a ball like true American assholes?" Another boy said something to Simon. "That's their only ball," Simon translated. "Screw it, I'll go get it," Jack said. "You sure?" asked Simon. "I mean, it's probably fine, but I'm the one that kicked it. I saw exactly where it landed, so I should get it. Besides, it looks pretty sleepy over there." "Okay," Simon said. "Just be careful and try not to step on that sandy strip. If you leave any footprints, the Border Patrol will be able to see that you crossed illegally." "What Border Patrol?" Jack asked. "There's no one else here." "Even so," Simon replied, "be careful." Then Simon explained to the boys what Jack was going to do, and they all looked at Jack, eyes gleaming like he was a superhero. Jack approached the sand strip and looked across at the forest. He judged that with a good running approach, he could just clear the sand and land on the thin strip of grass on the other side. He backed up next to the red and white striped Polish border marker and shook out his legs. Then he looked over his shoulder at his awed spectators. Simon gave a nod, and off Jack went. He dashed toward the border, planted a foot, and sailed over the sand. He fell into a roll in the opposite grass, coming to a stop next to the red and green Belarusian border marker. Simon and the boys gave up a big hoot and applause, and Jack nodded his appreciation. Then Jack turned to the task at hand. He spotted the white bark of the birch trees through which the ball had flown and walked toward the thick forest and into its darkness. The undergrowth was dense in the shadowy woods, and Jack didn't see the ball. It could be covered in leaves. It could be behind any number of fallen logs and branches. This wasn't as simple as Jack thought it would be. The trees were tall, and looking up at the sky through the rustling birch and pine canopy was almost dizzying. He kept walking, looking down periodically, but his eyes kept getting drawn upward. He couldn't take his eyes off the tall treetops swaying in the wind. Then his right foot hit something hard, and Jack started to fall. He thrust his left leg out to steady himself, but that too hit the object, so he fell face forward, his arms outstretched, over a thick, long pile of leaves. "Shit," Jack shouted, angry at his clumsiness. The soft ground, though, absorbed his fall, and he wasn't hurt. He assumed he had tripped on a hidden root or fallen tree branch under the leaves. He stood up and started dusting pine needles off his knees and stomach. When he saw the pile of leaves he tripped over begin to move. Out of the leaf pile, a man slowly stood up and turned to Jack. He stared at Jack with eyes as devoid of emotion as blue marbles. Then the man raised a rifle, a long rifle with a large cylindrical scope mounted on top, and pointed it at Jack. One eye disappeared behind the scope. The muzzle of the rifle practically tickled Jack's nose. The man's face was pale, his eyebrows blonde. He wore woodland camouflage, black combat boots, and a black beret. Down his back from his beret to his boots, he wore a ghillie suit, a hunting outfit covered in leaves and twigs. Jack stared back in disbelief. What the hell is happening, he thought, and he became scared, very fast. On the ground at the man's feet, Jack noticed instruments, those curved instruments surveyors use, and a blinking device that looked like a common GPS people take hiking. The man yelled something in a Slavic-sounding language, Belarusian or Russian, Jack assumed. Jack had been listening to Polish long enough over the last 4 days to know it was definitely not that. "I'm looking for a soccer ball," Jack said without thinking, holding his arms up in front of him as if to keep the soldier at bay. "Is this Poland?" he added in a lame attempt to make it seem like a big mistake. The soldier said something else in Slavic, this time less loud, less angry. But the soldier was very authoritatively flicked his head sideways toward the border. Jack understood. He started running west, toward the light, toward the open fields, toward the border, toward Poland. He looked back once and saw the soldier with his gun once again lifted to his shoulder, aimed right at Jack, and with a smirk on his face. Jack ran over the soft ground, leapt over some downed tree branches, and burst from the forest. He kept expecting the crack of the rifle, or worse yet, the impact of a bullet in his back. He was running full tilt, and at the lip of the sand strip, he launched himself through the air. But it wasn't enough, and this time he landed midway and kept running, leaving half a dozen footprints etched in the sand as clear evidence of his illegal border crossing. But he didn't care. Simon and the boys stared at him with expressions of shock and confusion as Jack barreled into them and fell to the ground, panting. They crowded around Jack, who sat up on the ground. The boys shouted at him and each other in Polish, gesticulating toward the forest. What the hell just happened, Jack? Simon asked calmly. In the forest, I tripped on someone. Someone? Who? Tripped? How? Asked Simon. I don't fucking know. Jack glanced up at the young boys with sudden concern, hoping they didn't understand his colorful English. A soldier, Jack continued, a soldier with a long gun, like one of those sniper rifles you see in the movies, Jack said. Where was he? The boys continued to shout, so Simon explained something to them in Polish, which settled them down for the moment. I was looking for the ball and I tripped on a pile of leaves. I fell down and some soldier, some Ivan Drago look-alike, pops up covered in a ghillie suit, leaves and twigs and moss and all. He aimed this giant rifle at me. I saw his eye, dead lifeless through the scope. Jack shook his head and breathed. Then what? Simon asked. Then he nodded toward the border and I got the picture and took off like a rocket back here. Holy crap, that was scary. Simon again explained something to the boys who were looking at Jack now with a sort of admiration. The boy in the green jacket then helped Jack up from the ground and said in a heavy accent, No football then? Sorry, knee, Jack said, exhausting half his Polish vocabulary. Then something caught his eye to the south. What the hell is that? He asked, resigned to more bad news. Across the fields, an army green jeep bounced over the furrows, leaving a trail of dust in the air behind. As it got close, Jack saw Straz Graniczna written on the side. Border guard, Simon said. Let me handle this. The jeep came to a halt next to the group, and two men in green camouflage uniforms got out and started speaking in Polish. Simon did most of the talking. The boys seemed frightened and intimidated, but Simon seemed confident and in control. The only word Jack understood among the rush of Polish was Amerykański. Fingers pointed everywhere. The police pointed at the border. Simon shook his head as he said something. The police pointed to the steps in the sand. Simon shrugged, shook his head, and said something else. The soldiers pointed to the boys, then Jack, and then Simon once again said something emphatically. Simon turned to Jack. They think one of us crossed the border. I insisted no one did. Clearly someone did at some point. They pointed to the steps in the sand, but I told them, sorry, we can't help them there. Finally, the situation seemed to settle down as the police stopped shouting and started speaking more calmly. Jack wasn't convinced the police believed them, but perhaps they were content with having made their point about the seriousness of crossing the border by scaring 4 boys and 2 grown men. But to be honest, Jack didn't think Simon looked all that scared, and he admired his ability to keep cool under pressure. Finally, muttering to themselves, the police got back in their jeep and continued driving north along the border, bouncing as they went, and leaving a plume of dust from the dried farmland in their wake. With the border guard gone, and Jack feeling safe from a bullet and arrest, the tension eased. Everyone agreed it was time to part ways. Jack, Simon, and the boys all shook hands and shared some laughs, and Jack apologized for losing their soccer ball. Just as Simon and Jack turned to walk back to town, there was a rustle in the trees, and Jack felt a slap to the back of his head, which knocked him face first to the ground. He didn't know what happened. He didn't know if that's what a bullet felt like, but he looked up at Simon and at the boys sprinting toward him, all laughing. And then Jack saw it. The soccer ball lay beside him. Jack rolled over and looked back instinctively, but saw no one. Then from the trees, he heard a shout. It was loud, it was long, and the language was Russian. But Jack didn't need a translation. He'd watched enough international soccer on TV to know that tone of voice and what it always meant, regardless of who was saying it. The soldier had shouted, "Goal."
That was Marc S Perlman reading to us from his new novel, The Riddle of the Trees. It was published by Koehler Books on March the 10th, 2026. Thanks so much for appearing on Story Radio, Marc. It was great talking to you.
Thank you, Tabitha and Martin. It was great being here.
Thank you.